Good morning, everybody. Apologies for being 5 minutes late starting the lecture today. As you would know, there's a live lecture from 9:30 to 11, and then there's a half an hour gap, and I have to move between one venue and the other. And today I've moved about 4 kilometres, so it's a bit of a rush getting from one venue to the other, but here we are. So we're doing the second half of week 1 today, and what we're going to be doing is still looking at the area of specialisation, still looking at the area of comparative advantage, and still looking at the area of trade. Only what we're specifically going to be looking at is not trading between people inside an economy, but trading between economies themselves. So I think I'll just move straight over to the lecture slides, and I might come back to you once or twice to talk down the camera a couple of times. I imagine that this lecture will take us about 75 minutes, something like that, to finish the topic properly. So I'm just going to go over to my slide presentation. And what we saw, let's revise where we were a couple of days ago. So we looked at the area of opportunity cost, and we then identified the principle of comparative advantage. And what comparative advantage is really centers around the idea of concentrating on those areas where we have a comparative advantage, and we tend to do those jobs all the time rather than diversify and do many different activities, some of which we won't have a comparative advantage in. So I think I spoke to you the other day about, give you an example here of a plumber who needs some electrical work done. Then what should the plumber do? Should the plumber do their own electrical work, or should they actually, this is what they will do more plumbing and specialise in what they're good at, and then ring the electrician and get the electrician to come and do what they're good at? So the plumber will be selling his plumbing services and buying electrical services, and this means we then link this topic to the area of supply and demand. So we've got our two agents, and they're inside our economy. But what we're going to do now is look at what happens when we think of these two agents together inside the one economy, and we put them together. So what we're going to do is we're going to find that we have two different production possibility curves. I want to go back and just remind you of what these guys' curves look like to start with. Let's go and find there's the slide. We can see that Leo has a little production possibility curve. Alberto has a absolute advantage in both, and also Alberto's slope here, the slope of his production possibility curve, is less steep than Leo's because his opportunity cost in bananas is lower than Leo's. So the slope indicates both how much we can produce and also the trade-offs. That's what the production possibility curve is indicating. So if we then put these two guys together in the same economy, they're going to wind up with two different curves combined into one. So let's think about the maximum that Alberto could produce and the maximum that Leo could produce. Remember, when we came to bananas, how many could Alberto produce? He could produce 16 in a day because he can produce 1 per hour. And then Leo can produce 4 in a day because his one takes 4 hours. So if we put these two together, we get 20, and there's our 20 here. So we get a total of 20 bananas. And in this economy, Leo and Alberto, if they put their efforts together, they could potentially make 20 bananas. However, that would involve making no rabbits. Remember, how many rabbits could they make in a day? Alberto could make 8 rabbits because that was going to take 2 hours, and Leo could make 4 rabbits. So that gave a total of 12, and there is our 12 marked on the line. And our line is a combination of those two slopes. I'm going to do Leo in red here. I'll just, the red line is actually Leo's production possibility curve. What does this mean? Remember, this number down here is 20. Leo is able to produce 4 bananas. So if Leo didn't produce any bananas, that would leave 16. And then Alberto would be producing 16. So Alberto can produce up to 16 bananas, and Leo makes the last 4. And we now have 2 separate production possibility curves in one. The black one, the black production possibility curve, is Alberto's, and the red is Leo's. And we've now got them on the same slope. Why are those two slopes different? Because their opportunity costs are different. The slope is equal to the opportunity costs. Alberto's slope is different to Leo's, and so there's 2 different slopes on the one line. And we've just seen that on the next slide, right? Well, I've just made the note for you on the slide. Leo's slope is higher than Alberto's slope. So Alberto's is line number 1 and Leo's is line number 2. Think about what Leo's production opportunity cost is. If Leo reduces his rabbits by 4, he would increase his bananas by 4. So that ratio is 1 to 1. But if Alberto reduced his production by 8, all right, he would then be giving up 16 units of bananas. So that slope is there. Well, in the slope of the line is 1/2, because 1 rabbit is equal to 1/2 of a banana, 0.5. So we've got the 2 different slopes because of the 2 different opportunity costs. We put them together, and now we have Alberto and Leo in one economy. And this means that Alberto and Leo could, if they wanted to, between them have 12 rabbits, or they could between them have 20 bananas. And they can have any combination they want. They have to choose together, but they can have any combination they want along their production possibility curve. That's now their collective choice, and they're going to have to decide between them how to what number of goods that they did want. So this slope that we've got in front of us now is an example of what we call the increasing opportunity cost, or what we sometimes refer to as the low-hanging fruit principle. I'm going to insert a slide here in case I decide to just if I need to free draw something. So this is the low-hanging fruit principle. I'm going to talk to you a little while about what the low-hanging fruit principle actually means. So if we imagine that you have a task of picking some fruit in an orchard. Let's imagine it's apples and you have to pick from the apple tree. And so you approach the apple tree and you're going to start picking bananas. All you have is you, your hands, your time, and you're going to be putting these apples into a bucket. So I want you to think about this. Where would you start picking the apples? Right? Would you climb to the top of the tree, using your ladder, climb up the ladder, harness yourself into the branches so you don't fall out and then start picking apples? Or would you simply stand on the ground and start picking apples? I suspect for most of you, you will pick apples, the apples from the ground level first. This is what we call the low-hanging fruit principle. Why do we call it low-hanging fruit? Because it's easy to get at, right? These are goals that are easy to achieve. And in economic speak, low-hanging fruit really means something that has a low opportunity cost. So I'll give you another example that you might relate to in your academic world. You've all done exams over time. You're all quite good at doing exams because you've all turned up at University of New South Wales. So you've got experience doing exams. So when you open an exam, imagine that there's a number of questions on the paper, some of which you're very sure about the answer, you're totally on top of, and which in your mind are easy marks. And then you've got other questions on that paper that you're maybe not so sure about, and those are going to be more difficult marks. So where do you normally start answering the paper? Well, most of you will start answering the paper with the easy questions because you don't want to run out of time and not have time to answer the easy questions. So you, in doing that, are obeying the low-hanging fruit principle. What you're doing is you're saying, I'm getting these marks and I'm getting them productively because I'm getting these marks without using a lot of time or effort in doing it because I'm already on top of the information. So that's exactly the same as picking fruit in an orchard. The person will start at the bottom of the tree because they can fill up their basket or their bucket of apples quickly. So there's a lower opportunity cost. They're not spending as much time. And then as they go up the tree, apples become more and more difficult to gain. And therefore, a bucket of apples from the top of the tree will always take more time than a bucket of apples at the bottom of the tree. And given that you could be doing other things with the time, if you're spending more time, you're paying a higher opportunity cost in terms of the other things you could be doing. So this is the low-hanging fruit principle. It's also got a couple of other names. It's also called the law of diminishing returns, which means that when I start picking my apples, I make a fair bit of progress quickly, but then my progress gets slower and my improvement gets less. You could also relate this to study. If you are studying a course, this course, for example, I want you to think which marks are going to be easiest for you to get. Will it be the first marks, the marks between 0 and 5, or will it be the last marks between 95 and 100? Now, it's still 5 marks, but you would all be aware that the first marks that you gain, the first progress that you make is pretty quick, and then to keep progressing and keep getting better, you need to invest more and more time as you improve your performance. And this rule applies. It applies in sports training. If you start training for an event, training for a running event or a swimming event, you will make pretty good progress early. But then to make progress later on. You need to invest more and more time so that when you get to the Olympic level, you're spending a lot of time on a very, very small margin of improvement. But of course, that very, very small margin may be the difference between running first and not getting a place at all. So the law of diminishing returns does operate in all areas of life, including business. So we'll get to some of that next week. So that's what we mean by the law of diminishing returns, or the low-hanging fruit principle. It means we can achieve gains with a small opportunity cost at first, and then later the opportunity cost tends to rise. So I'll go back to our slides. Okay, so we're back to our two-agent economy, and we've got our slides. So we've just added a little bit of detail into the notes on our slides. So we see that in this economy we can make up to 20 bananas, and Alberto should make the first 16. So as we increase our bananas moving along our axis to the right, I want you to think about what would happen if, when Alberto starts to increase his production of bananas. Imagine that, let's draw a little dot here, and we call that 4. Now, if Alberto makes those 4 bananas, that puts him at the black dot on the production possibility curve, and I want you to think about how much rabbits Alberto has given up. That's a 10, and the difference there, I'll clean both these up. The difference, we've gained 4 rabbits, right? That's the gain, and the cost. Sorry, we've gained 4 bananas. The cost is 2. So that's the cost. We've given up 2 rabbits to gain 4 bananas. But what about if Leo had made the first 4 rabbits? If Leo had made the first 4 rabbits, we have to go over here to see the effect. If Leo makes the first 4 rabbits, we're increasing the rabbit production by the amount shown in red, but the reduction in rabbits when he makes those first 4 bananas is -4, not -2. So you can see that the loss in rabbits, if Leo makes bananas, is much bigger than the loss in rabbits if Alberto makes bananas. So that's why Alberto needs to make the first bananas, because he has a lower opportunity cost, and the economy gives up less rabbits when Alberto does it. So the low-hanging fruit principle means that when we increase production, you first employ those resources with the lowest opportunity cost, and then only then, once this is exhausted, do you move to the other person in production. So let's go back to the previous slide. I'll clean all this up and we'll show you what we mean. Alberto can make up to 16 units of bananas. This economy can choose any number of bananas between 16 and 20. It could choose 12 bananas. What number is that? Let's call that 8 bananas. If this economy wants 8 bananas, what happens here is Alberto produces these 8 bananas and then uses the rest of his time chasing rabbits. But that's not an efficient use of his time to do that, because he now pays a higher opportunity cost. So we can choose to produce anywhere we like along this line. But if we want to, imagine we wanted 18 bananas, it wouldn't leave many rabbits available, right? It wouldn't leave many rabbits available. It would leave 2 available. But if we were to choose 18 bananas, Alberto should make the first 16, and then only after that should Leo make produce the remaining 2. So Alberto should exhaust his capacity, maximize his comparative advantage. Conversely, if we sort of turn that idea around, and we think about who should make the first rabbits, well, think about what happens with the first 4 rabbits, right? The first 4 rabbits, we're going from 0 to 4. What is the opportunity cost when we go from 0 to 4? There's our opportunity cost. It's shown in black at the bottom on the horizontal line. But what about the next 4? What if we decide we don't want 4? What if we decide we want 8? Then now Alberto is making these 4, the red 4, right? Alberto's making the red 4, and now he's going to give up 8 rabbits, right? Not 4 rabbits. So the opportunity cost is rising when Alberto makes rabbits. And you can see it rising. Look how you can see it rising. The first 4 rabbits I'm circling in green. The opportunity cost is the black one. And then the second 4 rabbits, the difference between 4 and 8, I'm showing in red. So the opportunity cost is rising. When it comes to rabbits, Leo needs to make the first rabbits because he has a lower opportunity cost, and we can see it on our diagram. I don't think we need this slide. I think I've already talked you through the principles here, except to show in this slide that these slopes represent the different opportunity costs, and then we can show the rising opportunity costs as we increase one product or the other. I don't think. As I've already done this with you. As we produce more rabbits, right? As we produce them again, we see that the second opportunity cost is larger than the opportunity cost for the first 4 rabbits. Okay, moving along then. So we're just going to take a little sort of turn for a minute, and I just want to talk to you about what we did the other day. I'm going to insert my slide here now. So the other day I spoke to you about the production possibility curve. So let's quickly just draw a production possibility curve. And we could draw our curve in a number of ways. So I could draw it like so, straight line. But today we're drawing it slightly differently. We've drawn it like that. And later on today, we'll be drawing it differently again. We'll be drawing it like that. But however we draw it, this line represents the maximum that we can produce. These lines represent the maximum that the firms can produce given their available resources. If we want to be outside the line, that's not possible with our production possibility curve, because given our present state of technology and given our present state of resources, there just isn't the capacity to be there. One way to get there is by economic growth. So we're really dealing with economic growth here much, except we want people to be aware of what it means. So if we were to get economic growth, and how would we get it? We might get it by building more infrastructure, more factories, more equipment, more transport, infrastructure, more population, better education, better technology. So over a period of time, even though we say that our production possibility curves do limit our production, over a period of time, of course, it is possible to bring our curve out. And I spoke to you, I think, in the lecture the other day about countries like China, that if we're thinking about China in 1980, I mentioned China because it has had a particularly high growth rate over its recent decades, slowing down a bit now. But between 1980 and 1926, of course, its curve, however we draw its curve is moving out because it's not only got more resources, particularly it's got better resources, more high-tech resources to produce more goods and services. So this is what we mean when we say economic growth. But we don't really get into the topic of economic growth in Micro 1. This is more, we would deal with it, and if you move on and you do macroeconomics, you spend quite some time on economic growth. But we're still in this, while we are in this topic, while we are thinking about our production possibility curve, and we redraw our production possibility curve. That's limiting what we can produce. This is our PPC, and we do want to be out here, but we don't have any economic growth in the present. How can we get to this point without any economic growth, or how could we get to that point which might actually lead to economic growth? So that's where we're going to next. We want to be outside our present production possibility curve because we want to increase our standard of living. So economic growth is one way, but the other way is trade. The other way to get to that point is trade. So I'm going to do a simple illustration with you here. I want you to think about, I've taken these two slides, I've dropped these two slides, I've actually taken them from another textbook, but I think they illustrate the point quite well. We have two producers. These producers are not Leo and Alberto. These two producers are Jara and the other guy is Peng. And the two products are not bananas and rabbits. The two products are coffee and nuts. Two products are coffee and nuts. Nuts on the horizontal axis. My eraser's not being very good to me here. I'll just leave those marks there. All right, so we've got coffee and nuts. Now, if we look at Jara, we can see that Jara clearly has a comparative advantage in coffee. He's an absolute advantage in coffee, should I say. He can produce 24, whereas Peng can only produce 12. So that's an absolute advantage. But he also has a comparative advantage because when he produces coffee, his opportunity cost will be lower than Peng's. When Peng produces nuts, his opportunity cost will be higher. Sorry, I've got to restate that. Jara has a lower opportunity cost for producing coffee, and Peng has a lower opportunity cost for producing nuts. Imagine that they both split their time, but they do not trade. They both split their time and do not trade. Where would Jara wind up? Jara would wind up on the red dot, right? He'd be spending half his time producing coffee and half his time producing nuts. And he'd have some coffee and some nuts, but where he could not be is at point F. He cannot be outside his production possibility curve. And at the same time, imagine Peng splits his time in half. He spends half his time producing nuts, half his time producing coffee, and he would be here where I'm making the dot. He cannot be where I'm making the second red dot, the dot that I've circled in black. He could not be there. But then imagine they do this. Imagine Jara and Peng both want coffee and both want nuts. So what does I've forgotten who's who. Okay. What does Jara do? Jara wants nuts, but he does not make nuts. He makes coffee. He makes 24 units of coffee. That's all he does. He makes no nuts at all. And Jara wants coffee, but he doesn't make coffee. He makes nuts. And then Jara says to Peng, what if I make 24 units of coffee and I give you 12? I give you 12. How many could I keep? I could keep 12. So he makes 24, but he keeps 12. And then Peng says, okay, yes, you give me, right? They go to the other guy, right? We'll call that to exports. And then the other guy produces all nuts, and he says, I'm going to produce 24 units of nuts, but I'm going to keep 12. And he gives them to the other guy, right, to the other party, to the other player, right, to the other agent. And now each guy has been able to, the guy who's producing nuts has made 24, but he's kept 12, and he's been provided with 12 units of coffee from the other player. So both of these producers can now have 12 units of coffee and 12 units of coffee and 12 units of nuts, and they are now able to consume outside their production possibility curve. So this, where I'm drawing the arrow, that is now their consumption. It's not their production, it's their consumption. But you can see that their consumption is higher than their production. So these guys have immediately increased their standard of living by trading with each other. The person who was good at nuts was able to buy the coffee, and the person who was good at the coffee was able to buy the nuts. So this is the concept of trade. And between them, what these two guys have been able to achieve here now, what they've been able to achieve is really they've been able to turn their two production possibility curves. Really, they've been able to turn that into a consumption possibility curve. And their consumption, that red line, is outside both of their production possibility curves. So now we've got a consumption possibility curve. So that's a new term, different to the production possibility curve. So what's the consumption possibility curve? It represents all the possible combinations all the possible combinations of two goods that a country can consume. And your standard of living doesn't depend on what you can produce. Your standard of living depends on what you can consume, what you can eat, what you can wear, what you can drive. That's what's going to determine your consumption possibility. So that's why trade is important, because those two players, those two agents, were able to capitalize on the expertise and the comparative advantage of the other person. They were also able to specialize in their own area of comparative advantage. So when we're thinking about the level of economic welfare in a country, in other words, what do we mean by economic welfare? We mean the standard of living. The standard of living. And so our economic welfare, what does it depend on? It does not depend so much on what we produce. It does depend on it, but it depends more on what we can consume. Now, of course, what we can consume will be a product of what we produce. Okay, so why trade? We trade because a country's economic welfare depends more on its consumption possibility. And you can increase your consumption possibilities through trade. Increase your consumption possibilities through trade. So this is a big economic principle, and of course it's very much open. There's a lot of debate about this topic in the world today because the United States in particular has introduced policies which in reality are designed to decrease its trade, particularly to decrease its imports from other countries by the means of tariffs. So there is, there's not universal agreement on this topic, or at least it's not quite as simple as the debate around this is not quite as simple as the theory would suggest. But if we think about countries that do trade and compare them to countries that do not trade, the countries that trade the most generally have had higher standards of living. And think about a country that trades very little, a country like North Korea. I think it has a very low standard of living, and one of the reasons it has a low standard of living is because it doesn't have access to all the goods that it could be buying. It could be buying from other countries. So this principle of trade and improving global standards of living, this has certainly played out in the last 40 or 50 years, and it's also the reason why countries seek to sign free trade deals with each other, or it's really the reason behind the existence of the World Trade Organization. So that's the principle of trade. We're going to move on now, and we're going to look at our country's production possibility curve, and we're going to be looking at trade. But what we need to be doing when we think about this is sort of a third trade-off price. So we've got the trade-off price for Alberto, which was 2 for 1, right? 2 bananas equals 1 rabbit. And we've got the trade-off price for Leo, and his was 1 for 1. And we know that they can trade with each other inside the economy, but now we're thinking about them trading with another economy, other economies in the world. So those other economies will be producing rabbits, and they will be producing bananas. They'll be producing obviously many goods, but we've got a simplified model here. They'll be producing the rabbits and bananas, and there will be a world trade-off price. So if we think about, say, the price of a car in the world price, it might be $30,000 US. and a price of coal in the world trading price, it might be $1,000. I have no idea what these things are really worth. But if one is worth 30 and one is worth 1, the trading ratio is 30 to 1. And we could show that on a diagram. We could show that on our diagram. So we're going to move back to our model of bananas and rabbits, and we're going to introduce a third line which shows the trade-off price, the relative prices of bananas and rabbits in the world, and we're going to superimpose it on our own production possibility curve. So let's go and have a look at our next slide. So this diagram, I think if Alberto was doing this lecture, he might explain this a little bit differently to me. But I'm going to explain it this way. The inner line here, the inner line, I'll just dot the inner line. In the end, I want students to ignore that line. I could draw that line, I could draw that same line up here. Right? I could draw that same line up there. The black line and the green line, and the red line for that matter, all indicate the same thing. When we're looking at this line, what we're concerned about is the slope of that line. So they're all parallel lines. They've all got the same slope. And what those lines indicate is the ratio of this product, bananas, and rabbits, what they trade for on the world price. What they trade for on the world price. So, maybe we've got 75 bananas trade for 50 rabbits. So one rabbit equals 1.5 bananas, right? So let's imagine that is the world trading price. And it wouldn't matter whether we draw it in the green line or the red line, the ratio, the numbers would be different, but the ratio would be exactly the same. And what we want students to do is to be able to move this line wherever we choose to draw it in the first place. Doesn't matter where we draw it in the first place, just the slope that matters. Where we want this line to wind up, though, is at a tangent to our production possibility line. So we want a line with the right slope that is a tangent to our production possibility line. So I have tried to get into the file and remove the inner red line, but I haven't been able to do that. So just ignore the red line. We're only worried about the black line here. That is the world trading price. I'm going to get rid of my numbers. All right, I'm going to get rid of my numbers. Give me a jiffy here. I'll clean this up. And we know what our numbers were, right? We know that remember this number was ultimately 20. We knew this number was ultimately 12. But now, if we trade with the world, we can get more than 20 bananas, right? We can get more than 20 bananas, and we could get more than 12 rabbits. What could we ultimately have? What we could ultimately have is this number of rabbits, or we could have this number of bananas. It's within our possibilities to increase our consumption possibility. So that black line now represents our consumption possibility curve. This black line is our consumption possibility curve. Now, how are we thinking about this black line? The way we're thinking about this black line is that This black line represents the price that rabbits and bananas trade for in the real world, and the red line represents the opportunity cost that we pay for these products in our own country. And what you can see is that the red line, the opportunity cost of bananas inside the country, is lower, right? It's lower. In other words, it's less steep, right? That line represents a lower opportunity cost. It's less steep than the world price out as far as point C. But then after, if you look at what happens after we get to point C, I'll put a C there. What happens after? The line is now steeper than the world price. What does that mean? What it really means is that if we're thinking about Alberto and Leo, Alberto is more efficient than the rest of the world in making bananas, but Leo is less efficient than the world in making bananas. So what should they do, right? What should they do? Well, what should Alberto and Leo should do is they can consume anywhere along that consumption possibility curve. So it represents all possible combinations. I mentioned point C, but they do not need to consume at point C. They don't need to consume at point C, and I'll show you why not. I've got to go back and clean my diagram up. They do not need to consume at point C. What they do need to do is produce at point C. They need to produce at point C. So I'm going to give you a few illustrations over the next few minutes of why they need to produce at point C. So I'm saying what needs to happen here is Alberto has a comparative advantage relative to the rest of the world. So Alberto should be he should be spending all his time making bananas. And imagine that along this consumption possibility curve, here's our consumption possibility curve. I'm highlighting in black. Let's imagine that this country, Alberto and Leo's country, they want this many bananas. They want X bananas. So why would Alberto produce all the way out to where I've just indicated on the diagram? Why would Alberto produce all the way out there? Because Alberto would produce out to, we'll call it point Z. They would keep X for themselves, and between X and Z, they would export them. They would sell to another country. And they would buy rabbits back. So and why would they do that? Why would they sell their bananas to the rest of the world and buy rabbits back instead of Alberto making those rabbits himself? Because the rest of the world has a comparative advantage in production of rabbits compared to Alberto. So Alberto should still specialize. The principle of specialization still applies here. Alberto needs to specialize in his area of production, and the country doesn't need to produce or consume all that Alberto produces. They can export the difference. So I want you to think about how this might operate in a country like Australia. We have a comparative advantage in producing many sorts of minerals, gas, agricultural goods. Does that mean that because we have that comparative advantage, we do produce our own gas, we do produce our own coal? But does that mean that we just produce what we need and don't produce any more? It doesn't mean that at all. What it means is that we produce to our capacity in these products, keeping very environmental laws in place, but we produce more than we need, and then we sell to the rest of the world. And what do we buy back from the rest of the world? We buy clothes, we buy electronics, we buy motor vehicles, we buy all sorts of products. So, and the reason that we produce more than we need of coal, gas, etc., is because we have a comparative advantage in doing it. And it's much more efficient for us to make the coal and buy the clothes than for us to make the clothes. So that's the principle involved here. Now, so this country could have, I'll transition back to the line, back to the diagram. So it is possible for this country then to consume at any point along this line, and any point. So it could consume at A, B, C, anywhere along the line, as a result of either importing or exporting to other countries. And we import if our comparative advantage is is more. We export if our opportunity cost is less. Now we've got an extreme example coming up where, what if, for example, I'll just remind you what Alberto's opportunity cost was. Remember, Alberto's opportunity cost for bananas, right, was 0.5 of a rabbit. And Leo's was 1 rabbit. Okay. What if the rest of the world has an opportunity cost that's both lower than Alberto's and Leo's? So we've got a line here, but actually we can't get a tangent to our line now, right? Because the black line is flatter than both the opportunity cost line for Leo and Alberto. So ultimately, what could happen here is this, that within our country, I'll clean up our diagram. How many bananas could we have in our country? Let me just clean this for a minute. How many bananas could we have? Well, we know that we could produce this many rabbits, and if this was the case in this country now, because bananas are so cheap, this very low opportunity cost and this very flat line represents a really cheap price for bananas. So although Alberto is better than Leo at producing bananas, he's not better than the rest of the world. So now both of these guys should produce rabbits, right? They should be producing up here. And then how many bananas could they buy? Well, they could get any number of these bananas. They could perhaps sell this many rabbits. They could sell this many rabbits and buy all of these bananas out here, right? They could buy all these bananas out here, more than they can ever make themselves. So, that's what this diagram represents. So here are the basic principles related to the consumption and production possibility curves. So we're moving towards our conclusions here today. Our production possibility curve and our consumption possibility curve will be the same if we don't trade, because we're limited to what we make. We can't consume anything that we don't make. So everything that we make, we can consume, but if other countries make these products, we can't consume it because we're not trading with them. So on the other hand, the consumption possibility curve will be to the right and above the production possibility curve. So consumption opportunities in an open economy are always higher, wider, better. Our standard of living will be higher if we trade, because we're using our comparative advantage, but we're also using the comparative advantage of other countries. So everything we've discussed applies so far, but now we're moving to a curved line. I'll talk to you briefly about what the curved line represents. In our economy so far, we had Alberto. Alberto had a sort of a fairly flat line. And then Leo had a steeper line. That's because Alberto and Leo had different levels of skill. They have different resources available to them. Maybe they've got different technology available to them, different amounts of money to invest in infrastructure or, their factory or whatever, different levels of education. Who knows what their difference is, but they've got different levels of skill. But we've only got these two guys. So Leo's steep curve and Alberto's flatter curve, we put them together to have a sort of a curve with two slopes, two gradients. But what if we had three people and they a third person has a different trade-off ratio? Then we'd have a steep person, a steep line. It's very hard to do this in front of a camera. Anyway, a steep line, a flatter line, somewhere in the middle. So each person is going to have a different slope. Imagine if we have 1 million people or 25 million people, 26 million people, whatever the population of Australia is. All of us will have slightly different levels of skill, education, expertise, other resources available to us. So when we think about putting all these people together, we're going to have lots of people with lots of different trade-off slopes. So let's sort of see how this translates back to our diagram. So imagine that we've got some people who have a slope like this, and then we've got some people with a slope like this, and some people with a slope like this, and some people with a slope. So we've got all different sorts of trade-off relationships when we think about the wide number of people in our economy. So that's why we say that our curve ultimately becomes a curve, because within this curve we have to imagine many different people, right? Many different people who all have a different trading or production possibilities and different levels of comparative advantage. So the people that are over to the left-hand side of the curve, right, the people over here, these people, they generally have a lower opportunity cost for producing rabbits. Why do they have a lower opportunity cost? Because you can see that we get a fair few rabbits and a fair few bananas, and we don't get many rabbits. So they've got a lower opportunity cost for producing bananas. But the people to the right-hand side of the curve, they have a high opportunity cost of producing producing bananas, because when they produce more bananas, look at the reduction in rabbits for them. The reduction in rabbits is much higher. The opportunity cost of producing those bananas is getting greater. So the principle of the principle of diminishing returns, or the low-hanging fruit principle, it still applies. To go from 0 out to X, we can produce these products with a low opportunity cost. I'm circling that in black. But then as we keep moving to the right, as we keep increasing our production of bananas, the opportunity cost the opportunity cost is getting greater. You can see the red arrow is much greater than the black arrow. And those two arrows represent the fall in rabbits as we increase our production of bananas. So, what do we do? What do we do then when we think about our world trading price? What we do is this: we still recognise, we still have to work out I'm going to put the line differently to where it is on your diagram. We still have to work out the trading relationship in the world between how many rabbits are traded at what ratio with bananas, and then we move that line so that's a tangent to our production possibility curve. We then get rid of the outer line. So we've only used that outer line or the inner line to give us the slope of the line. We then make that a tangent. Right? We make that a tangent to the production possibility curve. And then if we think about the production of bananas, it's the same principle as before. This is our production possibility curve. This line, the black line, that is our consumption possibility curve. We could have, I'm marking on the horizontal axis, we could have up to that amount of bananas if we wanted to, which is greater than the amount of bananas we could make ourselves. So we can consume more than we can produce. How many of those would we make ourselves? We'd make out to point Z ourselves. If we want any more bananas, we buy them from the rest of the world. If we want any less bananas than Z, if we want X bananas, we still make Z bananas, we consume X, and we sell them to the rest of the world. So whether we buy bananas or sell bananas depends on two things. One, how's the world price compared to our own opportunity costs? And two, how many bananas do we actually want? Because we could have any number that we want, notionally, between 0 and B. We might be out to, if we want exactly Z, we'd make them all ourselves. If we want more than Z, we'd make Z and buy a few more. So that's how we treat our consumption possibility curve, and what we do with it relative to the relative to trading with the rest of the world. So we just you can see that these two slides just represent what I've been saying, that over to the right-hand side, right, over in this zone here, the opportunity cost of bananas in the rest of the world is now lower than ours, and we should be buying bananas from them after we get to point Z. So that really ends today's lecture pretty much. We've got a couple of points to make, and then we'll finish off. So on our last slide, there's just a few points of note here to critique the theory of what we've been learning. What have we been learning? What we've been learning is this. First of all, identify our production possibilities. Secondly, identify our opportunity costs. Thirdly, identify our area of comparative advantage. Fourth, specialize in that area. And then on the basis of that, trade. If your if your opportunity cost is less than the rest of the world, you should export. If your opportunity cost is higher than the rest of the world, you should import, and that will indicate the areas in which you will be exporting and importing. As we know, in Australia, we export some products, we import other products. So those are the basic principles behind the theory. Now, are there anything that sort of we need to add when we're really relating this theory to the real world? Well, there are a few things on the last slide. So you can read the last slide, but I will talk you through it. First of all, if we're all specializing in our area of comparative advantage, some of us are going to have comparative advantage in very repetitive jobs. We might be doing something, we might be very good at picking fruit. That might be our area of comparative advantage. If we specialize in that all the time, well, maybe we get injured, right? Maybe we get repetitive strain injury by doing the same thing all the time. Or maybe we get, even worse, repetitive brain injury because we're so bored from doing it. So that's one limitation. The other limitations are that the real world has more complicating factors. For example, if there's not much difference between your opportunity cost and my opportunity cost, we still might trade, but if we've got to employ an agent or we've got to spend a lot on transport, you might be able to make the good cheaper than me, but by the time I go through an agent or by the time I pay for transport, it's not cheaper anymore. So, sometimes a country might have a comparative advantage, but not by much. And trade doesn't really work because by the time you get into all the transaction costs, any gains have been eaten away. The other thing about this is that real world politics comes into play. So particularly we're seeing this at the moment. We're assuming that this trade takes place because one country has a comparative advantage against another, and therefore it can easily sell to another. But if that other country imposes a tariff, which makes the trade, the import more expensive, then the country with the comparative advantage still may not get to sell its product to the second country because that trade's been either blocked or impeded by the imposition of a tariff. So this is not, you're then moving out of the world of economics a bit and more into the world of politics. And of course, that does complicate world trade, as we all know, if anyone reads anything to do with the news. So we've done the theory, but we also recognise that it is just a theory and the model is simple. When we come to relate this theory to the real world, there's a lot more nuance. So that really ends the lecture for today. It ends our topic. We're right on time. So we've finished the full topic with a few minutes to spare. Next week you have your workshops. I'm sure you've got questions, so make sure that you ask those questions in the workshop, or you can come to my physical consultation if you happen to be on the campus. So thanks for your attention, and we'll see you all next week.